Hello, welcome to the mini lecture on the creation of the modern environmental regulatory system in the United States. Really, the shift from the common law to the statutory system that we now see in place. This is in some ways a sort of good story, and that is why I wanted to devote a separate mini lecture to this. It's a historical set of events that provides us with some context as to why we have the system that we have. But of course, from a legal practice perspective, this is really just only broader context. Now, first slide that I have here is just a brief recap of the common law doctrines that were mostly used to address environmental issues prior to the 1970s. Principles of normally dangerous activities, strict liability, trespass, private nuisance, public nuisance. I won't go through them. We've covered them in a previous lecture. But they remain important as background principles and gap fillers, even today, and have become probably more important over the past few years as there has been some frustration with the inadequacy and the changing times that have made some of the existing statutory schemes outdated. Nevertheless, even though these doctrines have become more important, they remain, I think, even now much less important than they were prior to the 1970s. Right? It's just a function that we have a system now that was created precisely to address some of the modern pollution issues. I have separate mini lectures about how these doctrines, specifically public nuisance doctrine, continues to operate in the context of water pollution and air pollution, International Paper versus Ouellette, and also the AEP versus Connecticut case. So look to those as a deeper dive into how these doctrines actually interact with broad statutory schemes like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. The framing here of this mini lecture is, in addition to thinking about this, how the modern environmental regulatory system was created, is that of why the common law is essentially inadequate for changing times. Right? And the first pictures that I want to show you is just what the environment was like in the decades preceding 1970s, and that is environmental quality was increasingly getting worse. Why? Because industrialization, because urbanization, because changing lifestyles, certainly transportation, the car, and of course, industrialization were continuing to create more pollution that was inadequately addressed, was insufficiently regulated by governments. And so you have images like these in 1948 of smog masking the LA skyline, events like the Donora, Pennsylvania smog deaths that sort of had a similar analog in years prior to the London fog or smog that also caused significant deaths. If you want to see a popular illustration of that, there's a Netflix TV series called The Crown, and one of the episodes is devoted to the London fog, that big event where the fog lasted several days. And then another sort of a pollution event related to water pollution. Both of these really were significant motivation events that drove the enactment of the Clean Air Act and the enactment of the Clean Water Act. The water pollution issue here were the rivers that caught on fire, the Cuyahoga River specifically, and not just once but several times, because of so much pollution going into the river that the chemicals and hazardous materials ended up catching on fire. Common law doctrine, including public nuisance doctrine, was simply inadequate, and maybe one of the most important characteristic that we'll touch on again in class is this problem of the post hoc nature of public nuisance. Largely, even though you can, of course, seek an injunction, primarily common law doctrines, litigation is really designed to address problems after they have occurred, to essentially find a remedy rather than to prevent these problems. And as I said, you can make use of some of these public nuisance doctrines to address issues beforehand, but that's really the exception rather than the rule. Most of adjudicative processes of the common law is designed to provide a remedy after the problem has arisen. These essentially showed that the state of affairs at that time, in the decades before 1970s, was just a situation where government regulation was inadequate. Pollution was going out of control, and hence these phenomena. Now, it's worth spending just a minute here on how that government response changed. Right? In the decades running up to 1970, the federal government especially was becoming more involved. And I focus here on the federal government because pollution, of course, has always been a subject matter of concern to governments, but primarily really at the local and state level. What these events, like the Cuyahoga River fire and also the Donora smog deaths illustrated, was that state and local governments were insufficiently equipped or unable to address these problems. And therefore, because of the publicity coming with these events, the federal government became more involved. However, the current environmental regulatory system didn't somehow spring into existence out of nothing. There really were a sort of a gradual process where the federal government got more and more involved based on an evolving understanding of what the underlying obstacles to proper regulations were. And so this is essentially what you see here in this slide. Initially, the thinking was that states were unable to address it because they just didn't know enough about the environmental issues, about how pollution was a danger or how to properly redress it. And so the federal government took action to provide more research support. Then the sense became that the problem of state-level intervention arose out of inadequate resources. And so more funding and resources were funneled to the states or made available. Then, since that wasn't enough, the federal government took more of a leadership role in setting standards, asking states to voluntarily adopt them, based on the idea that maybe if the federal government created models for how pollution should be regulated, that would essentially solve the problem, that state officials just needed more guidance. And when that finally was insufficient, that is when in the early 1970s and throughout the 1970s, the modern environmental statutory system was created, essentially involving the federal government through direct regulation of pollution, imposition of direct regulatory requirements on industry and other polluters, and also through direct enforcement, the creation of the EPA to do both of these jobs. Okay. There's one other way to think about this evolution, that is through sort of an ongoing, a greater centralization of regulatory authority in the federal government in Washington, D.C., in the EPA, movement of authority from the states towards the feds by new congressional legislation. I do want to point out that that is actually not something that's unique to the environment, to environmental protection. That is something that we've seen in other areas of economic regulation as well. But of course, it's something that nowadays has been of concern to industry and others who oppose greater intervention by the federal government in things like the environment, who perceive that that is not to be appropriate. It's unfortunate, I think, that oftentimes the advances and the benefits of federal regulation are ignored, that we have a system like this for a very good reason, and that is that states were unable or maybe unwilling to fully address the pollution issues that we have to deal with in modern times. I think one other quick thing to point out is these two competing explanations of why the federal government got involved. I think what I've just set out to you, this progression from research to direct regulation, is one more consistent with a perception of states having inadequate capacity and inability to regulate. The alternative explanation that's been given for the creation of the federal environmental regulatory response is that of state competition, of a race to the bottom, and that maybe states were unable to regulate not because they could not, but rather because they would not, were unwilling to, because they wanted to attract industries and thought of lowering or keeping low environmental standards as a way of competing for industry, for economic development. I think that is an issue more broadly, probably applicable globally. So there's one other way of thinking about the story, however, which is sort of at a more micro level, and it makes for a story in some ways. The story is sort of two men, one being Edmund Muskie, a Democratic leader in Congress, and the other one of Richard Nixon, sort of this clash between two towering political figures in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Edmund Muskie at one point harboring presidential ambitions and thinking of the environment as a place where he might be able to make his mark. I don't want to sound cynical here, really just as an explanation of what historians have thought of as being part of Muskie's calculations. But I think it would be, of course, fair to say that he certainly thought of the environment as an important public issue, public policy issue, and seeing his role here as something that he could help the nation with, of course. On the other hand, on the other side, of course, Republican President Richard Nixon, unfortunately infamous for Watergate and his resignation, but certainly in the environmental law and policy area as somebody who deserves, I think, a significant place as a president who created the Environmental Protection Agency, and also as somebody who presided over the enactment, was a president who signed landmark legislation like the Clean Air Act amendments of 1970s and the Clean Water Act amendments of 1972, and of course, the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. The clash here in large part because, and it's an unusual event, I think, in that in the late 1960s, the environment and environmental policy really became an area of competition where both Nixon and Edmund Muskie sought to, simplistically characterize maybe, to outdo each other in how good of an environmental policy advance they could make. One has to think about the 1960s not only in the context of the Vietnam War and protests, but also as a time when the environmental movement really got its feet and really had quite a bit of political sway, that it led to this sort of competition to go to the top in terms of more environmental law and environmental protection. One of the things that came out of this, as I mentioned, of course, already, was the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The U.S. EPA was not created entirely from scratch, although it's, of course, a completely new agency. This is a document signed by Richard Nixon on March 12, 1970. The executive order, essentially, or what is referred to as Reorganization Plan Number 3 of 1970, that created the U.S. EPA out of offices and staff that were previously situated in other federal government agencies. That is the Health, Education, and Welfare Department, the FDA, the USDA, and there are really two chief entities created. One, as I mentioned already, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which is highlighted here, and the other one, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which did not become a standalone agency, but rather was situated within the Department of Commerce. But it is the agency that focuses on marine protection and broader scientific global issues, like they have a very important profile, high profile within climate change as a technical scientific agency providing research and technical understanding of oceans and atmospheric issues, right? But EPA was created then on March 12, 1970, and since we are in 2020, this means that EPA just turned 5 decades old. It's now middle-aged. Right? The other important development, of course, were the enactment of major environmental statutes signed into law by Nixon, but pushed through Congress by Edmund Muskie. And most significant, the very first one, of course, the 1969 National Environmental Policy Act, which provided this broad set of policy objectives for the federal government, but maybe more practically created a system of environmental impact assessment. Now, on my slide here, I also have a reference to 1963 Clean Air Act. For completeness sake, I guess it's worth including it. But really, for modern time or modern perspectives, it's the 1970 Clean Air Act amendments that really created the modern environmental air pollution framework. The other important statute that also was really revolutionary was the Clean Water Act amendments of 1992, or formerly referred to as the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. And we will, of course, go through some of these in more detail. I won't go through that now. But one other thing that I want to touch on is that, of course, EPA and NOAA are not the only agencies charged with environmental responsibilities. We tend to think of at least EPA as a primary one. That's, I think, where most lay people might associate the environmental work of the federal government. But a number of agencies also are involved, and maybe chief among them, I would say, really is the Department of Interior, which deals with many natural resource issues: wildlife, national parks, public lands, a lot of conservation issues. The Department of Commerce, because it has the NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in it. Department of Agriculture, because it has the Forest Service. And then the Council on Environmental Quality. It's an office that was created with NEPA, the 1969 National Environmental Policy Act, and resides within the White House. It is charged with overseeing the implementation of NEPA and provides more broad policy advice, policy counsel to the President and the Cabinet. A number of other agencies that are listed on the right-hand side, I won't go through them all, FDA, OSHA, the NRC, Transportation, Army Corps of Engineers, important because it also is involved in the implementation of the Clean Water Act. The Coast Guard deals with marine pollution, and the Department of Energy, together with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, dealing with nuclear materials. But Energy Department also addressing broader energy conservation issues, more and more important because of the relevance to climate change. And so we are going to primarily focus on the statute that EPA is in charge of, but also the Endangered Species Act, which falls largely on the purview of the Interior Department, as well as the Commerce Department or the NOAA. The last slide here that I want to touch on is this organizational chart. I do want to say up front here that this is outdated, and unfortunately I have not been able to find an organizational chart of EPA that is current. And so just for purpose of illustration here, it is a nice example of how an agency, for those of you who have no familiarity with the federal government's organization, how an agency like EPA is structured. Right? At the very top here, what you see is the administrator, which is essentially the equivalent of a secretary of a department, secretary of state, secretary of defense, etc. Here, the title of the head of the agency is administrator. You also have a deputy administrator, somebody who's directly in charge of daily operations. You might, if the administrator or the secretary is the CEO, the deputy administrator oftentimes would be deemed to be the COO, the chief operations officer. And directly to the side here, you have the general counsel's office, the lawyers, for all of you, of course, as law student, particularly relevant. And then so various policy offices, the lines here, and programmatic offices that manage the implementation of the statutory responsibilities, right? Writing regulations, enforcing them. I won't go through all these, but one other thing I want to point out here is that this line down to these, what are referred to as regional offices. EPA has 10 regional offices, including one regional office situated close by to us at Santa Clara in San Francisco. It's the headquarters of Region 9, EPA Region 9, and each of these regional offices has a regional administrator. And so it's kind of like a regional presence where the interaction with state and local government primarily occurs, but also where much of the local enforcement, regional enforcement of environmental laws occurs. And so the division of authority you might think of as headquarters in DC as focusing on national issues, on policy making, on writing regulations that affect the country as a nation. And the regional office is focusing on local enforcement and local regulation and policy issues, and so serving really as local liaisons to state and local government. Right? I'm going to stop here sort of as this introduction to the modern environmental regulatory system. What I've shown you is sort of what the background story was, the politics of the creation, as well as how this system nowadays is operated or structured in very broad strokes from essentially sort of 50,000 foot level. Right? We will talk more about administrative law and the administrative state separately, but this should provide you with some perspective of how our system, our modern system, is organized.